Hey everybody, my name is Rob Janicki and I am the author of the forthcoming book Slacker, 1991 Teen Spirit Angst and the Generation It Created. This is not the actual book, but it will look exactly like this, just a bit smaller. And it is coming out later this year via Inspired by You Books. I'm super excited about it. This is my first book. I've been writing for a really long time, going all the way back to, well, technically, I've been writing since I was a teenager, but I started writing on the internet and in magazines, if you remember those, back in the early 2000s as a freelance music writer. And I'll tell you my history in a minute, but I wanted to just welcome you to my YouTube channel that will talk about Slacker, talk about why I wrote it, and this will be a prelude to things to come that has to do with Slacker. Appearances, speaking engagements, book signings, appearances, all that sort of fun stuff. I'm currently on Instagram and Facebook and X, Twitter, LinkedIn, and all the places that most people are on. But I wanted YouTube to sort of be my focus going forward. As you can see, if you've seen the video right before this one, I tried it once before, but it really wasn't anything music related at all. It wasn't really built for that. I had a cardiac ablation back in 2020 because I was diagnosed with AFib. Medication wasn't working and my life was awful. So I needed an ablation and I was scared to death. So I did what most people do and I went on YouTube and I searched for people who had them, what the procedure was, and there were so many really good videos of people who went through it. Their symptoms were exactly like mine. They had the same ablation I had, or I was going to have, and watching their videos really helped me. It let me know what I was in for, it calmed me down, and it made the day of the ablation that much easier. So I figured, let me go on YouTube and create a video and sort of pay it forward to the people who helped me. I wanted to help people who were coming up on their ablation. And turned out it got lots of views and people were really happy that I did it. I seem to have calmed some people down just like others had calmed me down. So I guess I did what I intended to do. Now, fast forward 4 years, a lot has happened in my life. And I decided soon after that ablation, actually, to write a book. And the reason I wanted to write a book was I've been as big a fan of music as one can be, as far as I can tell. And I had this idea in around April of 2020, kind of right in the middle of the pandemic. I was in my backyard with my dog, just kind of watching him run around. And earlier in that day, I had heard the year 1991. Someone said it, maybe I heard it on a radio show or a podcast, but the year 1991 was said earlier that day. And I was just out in the backyard and I was like, wow. And this is in 2020. It's like 1991. That's, next year is 30 years. Now, for me, someone who loves music, and I'm currently 51 years old, so 91 was a lifetime ago, apparently. It was my freshman year of college. And but it's also the year that what's known as grunge and alternative music exploded and took over the world in terms of commercial music. Now, most of you know that happened with the release of Nirvana's second record, Nevermind, in the fall or late summer of 91. And that was a moment in history that marked, it was, how can I put it? If you were there, you know what I'm trying to say. If you weren't there, it was a moment in time that changed culture. And it changed it, in my opinion, for the better. And it changed it forever. I mean, here we are, more than 30 years later, and people are, not just me, obviously, people are still talking about it. The grunge and alternative movement that started in Seattle in really the early 80s, but became a commercial phenomenon in the early 90s, changed music, it changed the record industry, it changed so many things about the generation that was back then, the teenagers and the kids in their early 20s. It changed worldviews, it changed how we think about almost everything. And I knew I wasn't alone in that response, because all these years later, if you look on Apple Music, if you look on Spotify, if you just look anywhere on the internet with, grunge and alternative groups, pages, forums, there are still tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of fans around the world who listen to this music on a monthly basis. Now, you can't really say that about every single genre. Sure, you're going to have pop music and country and hip hop. Those are, always around, and they're kind of the biggest. But for a niche like grunge or alternative to be this popular this many years later, I liken it to my era's Beatles, right? I learned about the Beatles like the rest of us did the rest of us who were my age, in the late 70s and early 80s. And the Beatles and the British Invasion, the Rolling Stones, that changed culture. Before that, Elvis Presley changed culture. Playing blues music from, the black blues artists from before his era, but back then, the way the country was, there was no way that was going to fly. Unfortunately, so Elvis changed commercial music. Then the Beatles did it again. Punk had its moments in the mid-70s with the Ramones around 1975, and then again the British version in 1977 with the Clash and the Sex Pistols. But that had a quick rise and fall. And then nothing, really nothing, globally until Nirvana. And now Nirvana didn't fall out of the sky. That was something that was building, like I said, from the early 80s, around 1983, 1984, out of Seattle, Washington in the United States. And it kind of took over, or that music became what took over after Nirvana blew up. Anyway, back to my backyard. So I had this idea for this book. I'm like, 1991, I can't believe how many years has gone by. I'm really a product of that year and that generation and all the years that had followed. And the music of that time was really something that hit me very, very hard in a positive way. There's a story. There's a story in this. And I went inside and I started writing just thoughts, some ideas. And I mean, I can't go into everything now, but within, I don't know, a few months, I had 30,000 words written. And I said, this is a book. And I started to shop it. Never had written a book before, never tried to. Always wanted to, but never even attempted it. And I found a great indie publisher who thought that the idea of not only writing about the music at that time, but what I did and what makes this book different, I think, is that it's a historical document of what happened in grunge and alternative. But it's also its effect on culture and culture's effect on the people who wrote that music, the kind of music they wrote. For the first time in the early 90s, in the late 80s, early 90s, you heard bands and artists singing about isolation, depression, suicide. There were so many things that people feel, or were feeling, and people feel in general, that was expressed in that music, both sonically, the way the music sounded, and lyrically. And leading up to that, the radio didn't play that music. MTV didn't play anything like that. Music like that was only for the underground. In the late 80s, early 90s, you had, Paula Abdul and Lionel Richie and, just pop music that was great for what it is, but it really didn't do anything, for people's souls. It wasn't pushing those buttons. And then you start to hear people sing about the things that most teenagers feel and go through. Addiction, isolation, things like that, the other stuff I mentioned earlier. And suddenly you have people speaking for you in a way. It's like you know these people now. And so the music affected culture, culture affected music, that moment in time, the people who were writing the music, the age they were at the time, typically they were the guys were in their mid-20s and the girls were in their mid-20s who were writing this music that exploded in the early 90s. Someone like myself, I was about 18 in 91, so just a little bit younger than them, but we were all coming from the same place psychologically, culturally, and we found our home in that music. And so the book, Slacker, is about how the music of that time affected this generation, how culture at that time affected the music, and then going forward, where we all wound up all these years later and how it's still a part of our lives. So that's the basic reason and the basic introduction to the book. As you can imagine, I talk about every single band, for the most part, that had a role, or in my opinion, had the bigger roles in the music of the 90s, whether it be Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Mudhoney, Stone Temple Pilots. I mean, you name it. And then, there was a whole female explosion, which was incredible. Tori Amos and Liz Phair and Tracy Bonham and Alanis Morissette, look, the list goes on and on. We all know who the bands were. Then the revitalization of punk, kicked off essentially by Green Day, and the rest is history. But the book is also historical, so I captured all of that in the book. Anyway, welcome to my YouTube channel. I am going to post here a lot, excerpts from the book, people who I've talked about in the book, people I've interviewed, and all the projects that are relating to this. Going forward, I'll post here. I'd love to know your thoughts. Put them in the comments, please. There's a link in the comments for a place where you can reserve a signed copy of Slacker. I'll be doing an appearance in July in New Jersey. I'll give you more information on that. We will be announcing a pre-sale for the book soon, and then eventually an actual release date, and we'll have some parties and events scheduled around that as well. So follow this channel, like, subscribe, share it, and tell me what you think. Thanks, everyone.